The Galactic Council chamber fell silent as Ambassador Zixthar slammed 3 of his appendages against the crystalline podium. His species, the Velcross, had dominated the Western Spiral Arm for 12 millennia, and his words carried the weight of that ancient authority. The humans want full membership, these fragile creatures who break from a simple fall, who require constant temperature regulation just to survive. His translator clicked with barely concealed amusement. They don't even have natural armor plating or toxin resistance. A single plasma burn would end them. Around the circular chamber, representatives from 47 species murmured their agreement. The Theron delegate, encased in his environmental suit filled with sulfuric mist, released a sound like grinding metal that his translator rendered as laughter. The insectoid creche clicked their mandibles in what passed for agreement among their kind. Sarah Chen stood at the human delegation platform, her plain gray suit looking almost primitive compared to the bioluminescent robes and adaptive armor worn by others. She was just 34 years old, young even by human standards, but Earth had chosen her specifically for this moment, not because she was their strongest or their smartest, but because she understood something the Council had forgotten. "Honorable members," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the waves of dismissal washing over her. "You judge strength by what can be survived without flinching. We understand that. Your species evolved on worlds that would kill us in minutes. You've built your entire civilization on the principle that physical resilience equals worthiness." "Exactly so," Zixthar interrupted. "And your kind possesses no such resilience. The radiation levels on a standard Council vessel would give your crew cancer within weeks. The gravity fields we consider normal would crush your bones. You are, by any reasonable measure, the most fragile sentient species we've ever encountered." Sarah nodded slowly. "All true. Humans are weak. We admit this freely. Our skin tears easily. Our bones break under pressure that wouldn't bother a Velcross child. We need oxygen, water, specific temperatures, and even then, we're vulnerable to thousands of diseases and toxins. We are physically incredibly weak." The chamber rustled with surprise. Few species applying for Council membership ever admitted their own limitations so directly. Usually, they argued, presented evidence of hidden strengths or challenged the assessment criteria. The human was doing none of these things. "Then why?" asked Council Speaker Mordine, her 6 eyes blinking in sequence. "Should we grant membership to a species that acknowledges its own inadequacy? The Council's purpose is mutual protection and advancement. What could humans possibly offer?" Sarah's lips curved into a small smile. "May I tell you a story? It's about something that happened on Earth, our home world, about 300 years ago. There was a structure called the Chernobyl nuclear reactor. Through human error and design flaws, it exploded, releasing radiation that should have rendered the entire region lifeless for millennia." She pulled up a holographic display. Images of the destroyed reactor appeared, surrounded by abandoned buildings slowly being reclaimed by nature. The radiation levels there peaked at about 300 sieverts per hour in some areas, a dose that would kill any human within minutes. The ground itself became poison. The very air could end a life. "A tragedy of your species' incompetence," Zixthar muttered. "Yes," Sarah agreed. "But here's what happened next. The Soviet government, the nation that controlled that territory, needed to contain the disaster. They needed to seal the reactor, to prevent further contamination. This required sending people into zones where the radiation would kill them. Not might kill them, would kill them with absolute certainty." The Council chamber had grown very quiet. Even species that had witnessed countless battles and catastrophes leaned forward slightly. There was something in the humans' tone that suggested this story had not ended as expected. "They asked for volunteers," Sarah continued. "They explained the mission clearly. Go into the radiation zone, complete the necessary tasks, and die. Your death might take days or weeks, but it was guaranteed. Your body would break down at the cellular level. You would experience unimaginable pain. And yet, knowing all of this, over 600,000 humans volunteered." The hologram shifted, showing grainy photographs of workers in inadequate protective gear, their faces clearly visible through thin face shields. These people knew they were trading their lives for the possibility of containing the disaster. They knew they wouldn't see their families grow old. They knew they would die in agony. And they went anyway. They climbed onto the reactor roof where the radiation was so intense that their equipment failed within minutes. They shoveled radioactive debris with their own hands because the robots we sent couldn't function in those conditions. When their shift ended, they knew they'd absorbed a fatal dose. And they smiled. because they'd bought time for others to continue the work. Sarah's voice grew softer but somehow more penetrating. 3 men dove into the flooded reactor chambers to drain water and prevent a steam explosion that would have been catastrophic for the entire European continent. They swam through radioactive water in darkness, knowing that every second in that water was killing them. They succeeded. 2 of them survived longer than expected, but that wasn't why they did it. They did it because hundreds of thousands of people they'd never met would live because of their sacrifice. The Theron delegate's translator crackled. "This is madness. Why would any rational being accept certain death?" "Because we're weak," Sarah said simply. "We know we're weak. We've always known. And because we're weak, we learned something your species never had to learn. We learned that individual survival isn't what matters. We learned that sometimes the most important thing isn't living through the flames. It's making sure others don't have to walk through them." She advanced the hologram again, showing the massive concrete sarcophagus that entombed the reactor. This structure was built by people who knew it was killing them. Every shift, every day, they absorbed radiation that shortened their lives. Some died within weeks, others took years. But they kept working, kept building, because that's what humans do when we're faced with impossible choices. We're fragile, yes, but that fragility taught us something valuable. It taught us that courage isn't the absence of fear or the ability to survive anything. Courage is being afraid, knowing you'll break, knowing you'll die, and doing it anyway because it's the right thing to do. The council chamber remained silent, processing this information. These were species that had built their civilizations on strength, on the ability to endure. The concept of deliberately accepting destruction for the benefit of others was foreign to most of them. Zixthar's appendages twitched. "A compelling story, Ambassador Chen, but individual heroism doesn't qualify a species for council membership. We need reliability, strength, consistency." Sarah nodded. "Then let me tell you what else humans have done in situations where we should have died." Sarah Chen watched the council members shift in their seats, their various forms of body language suggesting discomfort or curiosity. She had their attention now, but attention wasn't enough. She needed them to understand something that couldn't be explained through simple demonstration of physical prowess. In 1972, a passenger aircraft crashed in the Andes Mountains on Earth, she began, pulling up another holographic image. Snow-covered peaks stretched endlessly across the display, beautiful and utterly hostile. The temperature regularly dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. The air was thin, making breathing difficult. 72 days without rescue in conditions that should have killed everyone within a week. The crash delegate clicked rapidly, the translator converting it to, "Surely no one survived such conditions. Humans require constant caloric intake and protection from cold." 16 people survived, Sarah replied, out of 45 who crashed. They survived by doing something that many species find horrifying. They consumed the bodies of those who had died, because the alternative was letting everyone die. They made an impossible choice and lived with it. She zoomed the hologram to show rough shelters built from aircraft wreckage. But that's not the remarkable part. The remarkable part is what happened when supplies ran out completely and no rescue appeared. 2 of the survivors, Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa, decided to climb out of the mountains to find help. They had no proper equipment, no training for such a journey, and no real idea how far they'd have to go. The mountains around them had peaks over 6,000 meters high. They were already starving, already weakened, and they set out anyway, knowing they probably wouldn't make it back even if they found help. Sarah's voice took on a different quality, almost reverent. For 10 days they climbed. They crossed glaciers, scaled rock faces, forded freezing rivers. Their bodies were breaking down from malnutrition. Their feet were frostbitten. Every step was agony, and every night they thought might be their last. But they kept going, because 14 people back at the crash site were depending on them. The hologram showed mountain ranges that seemed to extend forever. On the 9th day, they reached what they thought was the last mountain. They climbed it, expecting to see civilization on the other side. Instead, they saw dozens more mountain ranges stretching to the horizon. Any rational being would have turned back, conserved energy, returned to the relative safety of the crash site. But they didn't. Pareto looked at those mountains and said something that I think defines humanity better than any physical measurement could. He said, "I see mountains. I'll go through them or over them, but I won't go back." and they kept walking. Ambassador Zixthar's appendages coiled tightly, a sign of agitation in his species. This proves only that humans are stubborn to the point of irrationality. Perhaps, Sarah acknowledged, but that stubbornness saved 14 lives. On the 10th day, they found a farmer, who contacted authorities, and all the remaining survivors were rescued. 2 men, already dying, walked through impossible terrain on will alone, and brought salvation to others. She closed that hologram and opened another, or consider the Apollo 13 mission. In 1970, humans were just beginning to explore space travel. We were primitive by your standards, using chemical rockets and basic computer systems. 3 astronauts were traveling to Earth's moon when an oxygen tank exploded, crippling their spacecraft. The image showed a small, damaged capsule floating in the void of space. They were 300,000 kilometers from Earth, in a vessel that was rapidly failing. Their oxygen was depleting. Carbon dioxide was building up to toxic levels. The temperature inside dropped to just above freezing. They had no way to repair the damage. By every calculation, they should have died. But here's what humans did. Back on Earth, hundreds of engineers and scientists worked without sleep for 4 days straight. They invented new procedures, tested them in simulators, and transmitted instructions to the crew. They found ways to filter carbon dioxide using equipment that was never designed for that purpose. They calculated trajectories using slide rules and paper because our computers were too primitive for the complex math required in those circumstances. Sarah's eyes swept across the council chamber. And in space, those 3 astronauts followed instructions for procedures that had never been tested in actual flight conditions. They shut down systems to save power, living in near-freezing darkness for days. They endured carbon dioxide levels that caused splitting headaches and blurred vision. They manually adjusted their trajectory using stars for navigation, knowing that a single mistake would send them spinning into space forever. The commander, Jim Lovell, spent hours doing calculations by hand while his body temperature dropped and his fingers went numb. The lunar module pilot, Fred Hayes, developed a severe kidney infection but continued working because there was no other option. The command module pilot, Jack Swigert, stayed awake for the entire 4-day crisis, too afraid that if he slept, he might miss something crucial. The hologram shifted to show the spacecraft's trajectory, a long arc through space. They had one chance to enter Earth's atmosphere at exactly the right angle. Too steep and they'd burn up instantly. Too shallow, and they'd skip off the atmosphere and drift into space until their oxygen ran out. The margin for error was less than 1 degree. They made it. They survived because hundreds of people on the ground refused to give up on them, and 3 people in space refused to give up on life. They succeeded because humans have this bizarre tendency to look at impossible situations and say, "We'll find a way." Council Speaker Mordine's translator hummed thoughtfully. "These are impressive stories of survival, Ambassador Chen, but they demonstrate luck as much as capability. Many species have similar tales." Sarah nodded. "You're right. Many species have survival stories. But let me ask you something. How many species have deliberately put themselves in danger not to survive, but to help others survive? How many species have made self-sacrifice a core cultural value?" She brought up a new display, this one showing data streams and statistical analysis. "After we learned about the galaxy's other species, we studied your histories, your cultures, your evolutionary paths. We found something interesting. Most of you evolved on worlds where individual strength was paramount. If you were strong enough, you survived. If you weren't, you didn't. Natural selection favored the resilient. Humans evolved differently. We're weak individually, so we survived by cooperation. A single human in the wilderness usually dies, but humans working together, sharing knowledge and resources, protecting each other, we conquered our entire planet. We went from prey animals to apex predators not through strength, but through stubborn refusal to abandon each other." The Theron delegate's translator crackled with what might have been skepticism. "You speak of cooperation as though it's unique. All council species cooperate, do you?" Sarah asked quietly. "When a Velcross ship encounters a Theron vessel in distress, what happens? According to the records we've studied, each species assists their own and leaves others to their fate. It's rational, efficient, and perfectly reasonable given your capabilities. You help those who can help you in return. But humans learned something different. We learned that the person least able to help you might be the one most willing to try. We learned that courage isn't a calculation of odds or capabilities. It's a choice made despite the odds and despite the lack of capabilities. Sarah's expression grew more intense. In our first decade of space exploration, we lost astronauts. The Challenger disaster in 1986 killed 7 people, including a school teacher who had no obligation to risk her life in space. We mourned them, learned from the tragedy, and continued exploring. Because that's what humans do. We fail, we suffer, we die, and we keep going. The council chamber's lighting dimmed slightly as the ventilation systems cycled through their atmospheric adjustments. Sarah Chen noticed several delegates conferring quietly with their advisors, their various forms of communication creating a subtle symphony of clicks, hums, and translated whispers. She had shaken their certainty, but she hadn't yet convinced them. Ambassador Zixthar's appendages uncoiled slightly, a gesture that Sarah's cultural briefing had taught her, indicated reluctant interest. Your stories are moving, Ambassador Chen, but emotion is not the basis for policy decisions. You've shown us that humans can endure suffering and make sacrifices. This is admirable in its own way, but the Council requires members who can contribute to galactic stability, who can defend shared interests, who can project strength when needed. Sarah took a breath. This was the moment she'd been preparing for. Then let me tell you about human strength. Not the kind you measure in plasma resistance or gravitational tolerance, but the kind that has allowed us to survive everything our universe has thrown at us. She activated a new holographic display, this one showing a timeline of human history marked with countless red indicators. Every one of these markers represents a catastrophe that should have ended humanity. Volcanic eruptions that blocked out our sun for years, ice ages that covered our continents in kilometers of ice, plagues that killed substantial percentages of our population, asteroids that created global firestorms, wars that deployed weapons capable of rendering our entire planet uninhabitable. And yet we're still here, not because we're strong enough to survive these things individually, but because we're too stubborn to let extinction be the end of the story. The Kresh delegates' mandibles clicked rapidly. Survival through disaster is common to all spacefaring species. We all faced extinction events in our development. But how many of you created your own extinction events and then chose not to use them? Sarah asked. In the mid-20th century, humans developed nuclear weapons capable of destroying our entire civilization. We built enough of them to kill every person on Earth dozens of times over. We aimed them at each other, came within minutes of launching them, and then didn't. She brought up images of Cold War bunkers, missile silos, and submarine bases. For decades, we lived with the knowledge that our entire species could end at any moment because of a single miscalculation or a leader's bad decision. The fear was constant, the tension was unbearable, and somehow we talked each other down from the edge again and again. There were moments when nuclear war seemed inevitable. In 1962, during something we call the Cuban Missile Crisis, Soviet submarines were being depth-charged by American destroyers. The submarine commanders thought war had already begun. They had authorization to launch nuclear torpedoes. 3 officers had to agree to launch. 2 voted yes. One man, Vasily Arkhipov, voted no and convinced the others to surface instead. Sarah's voice grew softer. One man making one decision probably prevented a war that would have killed hundreds of millions of people. He wasn't particularly strong or fast or resistant to damage. He was just a human who looked at the possibility of global annihilation and said, "No, we can find another way." That happened dozens of times during those decades. Computer glitches that reported incoming missiles when there were none. Officers who were supposed to launch retaliatory strikes but waited to confirm. Diplomats who kept talking even when their governments wanted war. Again and again, humans who were supposed to follow orders chose to think instead, to question, to buy time for cooler heads to prevail. Council Speaker Mordine's 6 eyes blinked in a pattern that suggested deep thought. You're saying that humans view restraint as a form of strength? I'm saying we learned that true strength isn't about how much damage you can endure or inflict. It's about knowing when not to use the power you have. Sarah gestured to the assembled delegates. Every species in this chamber is physically superior to humans in some way. Most of you are superior in many ways. But I've read your histories and I've noticed something interesting. The Velcross Empire expanded through conquest for 8,000 years before establishing the territories you hold today. The Theron Collective absorbed 17 species during your development phase, incorporating them into your society whether they wished it or not. The creche consumed entire ecosystems on 32 worlds before developing synthetic alternatives. None of these actions were evil by your standards. They were rational applications of strength. The chamber had grown very quiet. Sarah was treading on dangerous ground, referencing histories that most species preferred to keep unexamined, but she pressed forward. Humans did all of those things too. We conquered, we enslaved, we destroyed, but we also developed something else. The ability to recognize when we were wrong and to change course. Not because we were forced to, but because we chose to. She brought up more images. We had slavery and we fought a war with ourselves to end it. We had colonization, and we gave independence back to colonized peoples. We had apartheid, segregation, genocides, and we worked to dismantle those systems. Not perfectly, not quickly enough, but we did it even though the powerful had every reason to maintain their power. You want to know what makes humans valuable to the Galactic Council? It's not that we're strong, it's that we've learned to be weak together. We've learned that admitting you're wrong is harder than fighting. We've learned that changing yourself is more difficult than changing others. We've learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not proving your strength, but acknowledging your weakness and asking for help. Ambassador Zixthar's translator carried a tone of frustration. These are philosophical arguments, Ambassador Chen. The Council deals in practical realities. Your species wants membership, but you haven't demonstrated what practical contributions you could make. Sarah smiled slightly. Then let me be practical. You're right that humans are physically weak. We can't survive on most of your worlds without significant life support. We're vulnerable to radiation, extreme temperatures, high gravity, toxic atmospheres, and countless other environmental factors that you consider normal. But you know what humans can do? We can empathize with other weak species. We can understand what it's like to be the most vulnerable being in the room. And there are hundreds of species in this galaxy that meet your criteria for sentience, but not your criteria for council membership, because they're too fragile, too specialized, or too dependent on specific environmental conditions. She pulled up data showing dozens of species the council had encountered, but never integrated. These species have knowledge, culture, art, and scientific insights that could benefit everyone. But they can't join the council because they can't meet your physical standards. Humans can be the bridge between your strong species and these vulnerable ones. We can translate not just language but experience. We understand both the fear of being weak and the desire to contribute despite that weakness. Moreover, humans have spent our entire history developing technologies specifically to overcome our physical limitations. We can't survive in deep space, so we built spacecraft. We can't breathe underwater, so we invented diving equipment. We can't tolerate extreme cold, so we developed heating systems. Every aspect of human technology is designed to let weak beings function in hostile environments. Council Speaker Mordine leaned forward, her 6 eyes focusing intently on Sarah. You're proposing that humanity serve as intermediaries between the Council and species we've deemed too fragile for membership? I'm proposing that humans could help you realize you've been asking the wrong question, Sarah replied. You ask, how strong are they? Maybe you should be asking, what can they contribute despite their weakness? Because strength without purpose is just potential energy. It's not until you apply it towards something meaningful that it becomes valuable. The council chamber erupted in debate. Delegates who had been silent throughout Sarah's presentation now activated their communication systems, arguing with each other in a cacophony of translated voices. Some seemed intrigued by her proposal, while others appeared offended by the suggestion that their criteria for membership might be flawed. Sarah stood quietly at her podium, waiting for the storm to pass. She'd expected this reaction. Challenging the fundamental assumptions of a civilization that had existed for millennia was never going to be received calmly. But she'd studied the council's history thoroughly, and she knew something they might have forgotten about themselves. Council Speaker Mordine raised her primary appendage, and the chamber gradually fell silent. Her 6 eyes regarded Sarah with an expression that the human hoped indicated thoughtfulness rather than irritation. Ambassador Chen, you make interesting philosophical arguments, but you still haven't addressed our primary concern. Regardless of your species' emotional resilience or cultural values, the practical reality remains. Humans are physically incapable of operating in most galactic environments without extensive life support. That's true, Sarah acknowledged. A human can't survive on a Velcross ship without climate control. We'd die on a Theron colony world in minutes. The crash home planet's atmospheric composition would kill us almost instantly. We are, by any objective measure, incompatible with most of the galaxy's standard environments. She paused, letting that admission hang in the air. But let me tell you about a human named Jerry Nielsen. In 1999, she was a doctor working at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station in Antarctica. During the winter, when temperatures drop to -70 degrees Celsius and storms make travel impossible, she discovered a lump in her breast. Cancer. The holographic display showed a research station surrounded by endless ice and darkness. She was trapped there for months before rescue was possible. The winter at the South Pole is so harsh that aircraft can't fly there safely. She was the only physician at the station, which meant she had to treat her own cancer using limited medical supplies and instructions transmitted from doctors thousands of kilometers away. She performed a biopsy on herself, looking at her own cells under a microscope to confirm the diagnosis. Then she administered her own chemotherapy, training other station personnel to help with the injections because she knew she'd eventually become too weak to do it alone. For months, she treated herself in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, maintaining her duties as the station's doctor even as the treatment made her increasingly ill. Sarah's voice carried a note of admiration. She didn't just survive, she thrived. She documented everything, turning her experience into a medical case study that helped others. When rescue finally became possible, she walked to the aircraft on her own power. Having beaten cancer in a place where most species would have died from the environment alone, never mind the disease. The crash delegate's translator clicked thoughtfully. This demonstrates individual fortitude, but one exceptional case doesn't represent an entire species. You're right, Sarah agreed. So let me tell you about an entire group of humans who did something similar. In 2010, 33 miners were trapped 700 meters underground in Chile after a cave-in. They were in a space about the size of a small apartment with limited food, water, and air. The temperature was over 35 degrees Celsius with near 100% humidity. Rescue would take months. Images of the San Jose mine appeared in the hologram. The mining company expected to recover bodies, not survivors. The Chilean government brought in experts who said rescue was impossible. The chamber where the miners were trapped was too deep, the rock was too unstable, and the equipment needed to reach them didn't exist. Every calculation said those men would die, but humans are really bad at accepting what calculations tell us is impossible. Engineers designed new drilling equipment specifically for this rescue. Workers operated that equipment around the clock, drilling through rock that kept collapsing their boreholes. They failed 17 times before finally reaching the trapped miners. 69 days after the collapse, all 33 miners were pulled to the surface alive. Sarah gestured at the council members. Here's what I find interesting about that rescue. It wasn't exceptional by human standards. When humans hear that someone is trapped and dying, our instinctive response is to ask, how do we save them? Not can we save them? We did something similar when 12 boys and their soccer coach got trapped in a flooded cave in Thailand. Divers from multiple countries spent weeks in dangerous conditions to bring them all out safely. We did it again when a submarine got stuck in the Arctic, and when earthquakes buried people in collapsed buildings, and when tsunamis stranded communities on islands. This pattern repeats throughout human history. We encounter impossible situations, ignore the impossibility, and find solutions anyway. Ambassador Zixthar's appendages coiled tightly. These are rescue operations within your own species. They don't demonstrate any particular capability for contributing to galactic security or prosperity. Sarah had been waiting for this objection. Then let me tell you what happened last year, when we encountered our first alien species that wasn't part of the Council. The Talari, a pre-spaceflight civilization living on a planet that's about to experience a massive solar flare event. Your survey ships identified them, classified them as non-viable for Council membership due to their primitive technology, and moved on. The hologram shifted to show a blue-green planet orbiting an unstable star. According to Council protocols, you don't interfere with pre-spaceflight species. That's a reasonable policy based on thousands of years of experience. But humans looked at that situation and saw 7 billion sentient beings who were going to die because they didn't yet have the technology to detect or escape the danger coming for them. So we broke your rules. We sent a delegation to Talari, revealed ourselves, and explained the danger. Then we helped them evacuate their entire population to their system's outer planets and moons. Over 3 years, we transported 7 billion people using human ships and human crews, working alongside Talari, who learned our technology faster than any species you've ever encountered. The council chamber erupted again. This revelation was clearly news to most delegates, and the response was immediate and heated. Council Speaker. Mordine's eyes all fixed on Sarah with an intensity that would have been intimidating if the human hadn't been expecting exactly this reaction. You violated the prime directive of non-interference? Mordine's translator crackled with barely controlled anger. You revealed the existence of galactic civilization to a pre-contact species without council authorization? Yes, Sarah said simply. Because your prime directive prioritizes political stability over individual lives. And humans have this annoying habit of valuing lives more than policies. 7 billion Talari are alive today because we made that choice. Their civilization continues to exist, to grow, to create art and science and culture. They know about the galaxy now, yes, but they're not traumatized by that knowledge. They're excited by it. In fact, they're so excited that they want to help. The Talari have developed radiation shielding technology that works on principles your scientists haven't discovered yet. They're sharing that technology freely with anyone who wants it, including council species. They've also volunteered to help with any future rescue operations, because humans taught them something important, that being saved by strangers creates an obligation to help save other strangers. Sarah's expression grew more serious. That's what humans bring to the Galactic Council. Not physical strength or environmental resilience, but a fundamental unwillingness to accept that suffering is inevitable, just because helping is difficult. We bring the audacity to look at your carefully calculated impossibilities and say, we'll try anyway. The debate in the council chamber had shifted from dismissive amusement to genuine controversy. Sarah could see delegates arguing passionately with each other, their translated words overlapping in a storm of conflicting opinions. Some seemed outraged by humanity's violation of council protocol, while others appeared intrigued by the results of that violation. Council Speaker Mordine finally restored order by activating the chamber's priority override, which temporarily disabled all delegate communication systems except her own. Ambassador Chen, you've admitted to a serious breach of galactic law. The non-interference directive exists for sound reasons, developed over millennia of experience with pre-contact species. Many such civilizations have been psychologically damaged by premature exposure to galactic civilization. That's true, Sarah acknowledged, and we studied those cases carefully before making our decision. But we noticed something interesting in your records. Every species that was traumatized by contact had one thing in common. They were contacted by beings who treated them as curiosities or resources, not as equals. She pulled up data from council archives. The Meraxians encountered the Peltok Empire and were enslaved for 3 generations before the council intervened. The Quextar were studied by Kresh scientists who treated them like laboratory animals. The Vornel were offered technology they couldn't possibly understand and collapsed into civil war trying to control it. In every case of traumatic contact, the contacted species was treated as inferior by the contacting species. Humans approached the Talari differently. We didn't position ourselves as saviors or superiors. We said, we're also new to this galaxy. We've discovered a danger heading toward your planet, and we'd like to help you escape it if you're interested. We offered assistance, not dominance. We provided technology with comprehensive education, not superior tools without understanding. And most importantly, we asked what they wanted rather than telling them what they needed. The Theron delegate's translator hummed with skepticism. A convenient narrative, but it doesn't excuse the violation of established protocol. No, it doesn't, Sarah agreed. Humans have never been very good at following protocols when we think those protocols are causing harm. That's both our greatest strength and our most frustrating weakness, depending on your perspective. She gestured at the assembled delegates. Every species in this chamber followed the rules as you developed. You worked within established frameworks, respected boundaries, and built your civilizations through careful adherence to proven principles. That's admirable, and it's produced a stable galactic civilization that has endured for millennia. But stability has a cost. You've become so focused on maintaining what works that you've stopped experimenting with what might work better. You encounter problems and apply established solutions, even when those solutions are inadequate. The Talari situation is a perfect example. Your protocol said, don't interfere with pre-contact species. So you didn't interfere. even though billions of sentient beings were about to die unnecessarily. Sarah's tone softened. I'm not criticizing your decision. Given your protocols and your experience, non-interference made perfect sense. But humans aren't burdened by millennia of established procedure. We're new, naive, and dumb enough to question whether the rules actually serve their intended purpose in every situation. Ambassador Zixthar's appendages uncoiled slightly, which Sarah had learned indicated a reluctant willingness to engage seriously with an argument. You're suggesting that humanity's value to the Council lies in your willingness to break our laws? I'm suggesting that humanity's value lies in our willingness to question whether the rules still serve their original purpose, Sarah clarified. Every law you have was created to solve a specific problem at a specific time. But circumstances change, technology advances, and sometimes old solutions become new problems. She brought up a historical chart of Council decisions. For instance, your non-interference directive was established after the Peltok Empire caused severe damage through aggressive contact with developing species. That was 3,000 years ago. Since then, you've accumulated extensive knowledge about successful contact protocols, psychological preparation methods, and cultural integration techniques. But you've never updated the directive to account for that knowledge because changing established law is difficult and potentially destabilizing. Humans don't have that problem yet. We're still figuring out what our rules should be, which means we're flexible in ways you can't afford to be. We can experiment with approaches that seem risky to you because we don't have millennia of stability to protect. And when we fail, which we will, we can learn from those failures without destabilizing an entire galactic civilization. Council Speaker Mordine's 6 eyes blinked in a thoughtful pattern. You're proposing that humanity serve as an experimental branch of Council policy? That we allow you to attempt approaches we consider too risky and learn from your results? In a way, yes, Sarah said. But more than that, we bring a perspective you've lost. You know what it's like to be strong, established, and secure. We know what it's like to be weak, uncertain, and vulnerable. That perspective matters when dealing with species that are struggling, suffering, or facing extinction. She pulled up images of human history again, but this time focusing on more recent events. In the 21st century, humans faced what we call the climate crisis. Our industrial development had altered our planet's atmosphere, causing temperature increases that threatened our civilization. We'd created the problem through ignorance, and by the time we understood it, fixing it seemed impossible. Every calculation said we couldn't transition away from fossil fuels fast enough to prevent catastrophic damage. The economic costs seemed unbearable. The political will didn't exist. The technology wasn't ready, and yet we did it anyway. Not perfectly, not quickly enough to prevent all damage, but we did it. We rebuilt our entire energy infrastructure in less than a century because the alternative was accepting our own extinction. The reason we succeeded was because we refused. To accept that difficulty meant impossibility. Young people who would inherit a damaged planet demanded change. Scientists developed new technologies faster than anyone predicted. Engineers implemented solutions that seemed economically unviable but worked anyway. And ordinary people made millions of small changes that added up to a global transformation. Sarah's voice grew more passionate. That's what humans do. We look at problems that seem insurmountable and we start solving them anyway, one small piece at a time. We don't wait for perfect solutions or ideal conditions. We start with what we have and figure out the rest as we go. The Kresh delegates' mandibles clicked in what might have been approval or skepticism. These examples all involve human problems with human solutions. You haven't demonstrated that your approach would work with challenges facing the Council. Then let me tell you about the Viridian Plague, Sarah said quietly. 6 months ago, a disease emerged on the Viridian colony world that affects synthetic organisms. The Kresh were the primary victims, though several other Council species with cybernetic enhancements were also at risk. Your scientists studied the plague, determined it was based on a novel self-replicating nanite, and calculated that developing a cure would take approximately 5 years. She pulled up medical data and research reports. Humans heard about this and immediately started working on the problem. Even though we have no synthetic organisms and the plague couldn't affect us directly, we approached it from a completely different angle than your scientists. Instead of trying to develop a counter-nanite, which is what your researchers were attempting, we looked at how humans deal with viral infections. We can't destroy viruses directly, So we've developed ways to teach our immune systems to recognize and eliminate them. We thought, what if we could teach creche biological components to identify and reject the plague nanites? It seemed absurd because creche biology is so different from ours, but we tried anyway. It worked, not perfectly, and not as a cure, but as a treatment that could contain the plague until your scientists finished developing their proper solution. Instead of 5 years with thousands dying each week, the creche had a treatment available in 3 months that reduced deaths by 70%. Your scientists will still complete their cure, but thousands of creche are alive today because humans were naive enough to try something your experts knew wouldn't work. Ambassador Zixthar's appendages coiled and uncoiled in a pattern Sarah couldn't quite interpret. I was not aware humans had contributed to the plague response. The official reports credited creche medical researchers. Because we didn't ask for credit, Sarah said simply. We didn't help because we wanted recognition or political advantage. We helped because people were dying and we thought we might be able to do something about it. That's very human. We don't calculate the return on investment before deciding whether someone's suffering is worth addressing. She looked around the chamber at the assembled delegates. You want to know what humans bring to the Galactic Council? We bring the perspective of people. The council chamber had fallen into a contemplative silence. Sarah could see delegates processing what she'd said, their various forms of body language suggesting deep thought rather than dismissal. She'd given them a great deal to consider, but she wasn't finished yet. There was one more thing they needed to understand about humanity. Council Speaker Mordine's translator hummed softly. Ambassador Chen, you've made compelling arguments about human values and accomplishments. But I must ask a difficult question. Your species has existed as a unified civilization for less than 2 centuries. The Council has maintained stability for 12 millennia. What makes you think human approaches would remain effective over such vast timescales? Idealism is common among young civilizations. It rarely survives prolonged contact with reality. Sarah had expected this question. It was perhaps the most legitimate concern the Council had about humanity. You're right that humans are young and idealistic, but I don't think idealism is something that fades with age if it's rooted in practical experience rather than naive hope. She brought up another holographic display, this one showing a timeline of human civilization, with particular emphasis on recurring patterns. Humans have been rescuing each other from disasters for as long as we have recorded history. 4,000 years ago, Egyptian records describe rescue efforts after Nile floods. 2,000 years ago, Roman firefighters rushed into burning buildings to save people. 1,000 years ago, Chinese communities organized disaster relief after earthquakes. This pattern doesn't emerge from idealism. It emerges from the practical reality that humans survive better when we help each other. Our idealism, as you call it, is actually enlightened self-interest that has proven effective across millennia of our own history. We help others not because we're naive, but because we've learned that societies where people help each other are more resilient, more innovative, and more successful than societies where everyone looks out only for themselves. The Theron delegate's translator crackled. Yet your own history is filled with war, exploitation, and cruelty. How do you reconcile your claims of human compassion with the violence evident in your historical records? I don't reconcile them, Sarah said bluntly. Humans are capable of extraordinary compassion and extraordinary cruelty, often simultaneously. We've committed genocides and then worked to prevent future genocides. We've enslaved each other and then fought to end slavery. We've destroyed environments and then developed technologies to restore them. We are fundamentally a species in constant conflict with our own worst impulses. She gestured at the assembled delegates. But here's what I've noticed about council species. Most of you resolved those conflicts in your distant past. You eliminated your capacity for large-scale cruelty through biological or cultural evolution, and now you're stable, peaceful, and predictable. That's admirable, but it also means you've forgotten what it's like to struggle with moral choices that don't have clear answers. Humans still struggle with those choices every day. We still have people who want to help and people who want to harm. We still debate whether individual freedom is more important than collective security. We still argue about when intervention is justified and when it's imperialism. These conflicts are uncomfortable and sometimes painful, but they keep us morally engaged in ways that I suspect you've lost. Ambassador Zixthar's appendages formed a complex pattern that Sarah's cultural briefing suggested indicated deep skepticism. You're arguing that moral uncertainty is an asset? I'm arguing that moral certainty can be dangerous, Sarah replied. When you're absolutely certain you're right, you stop questioning your assumptions. You stop examining whether your solutions are actually working. You stop listening to people who disagree with you because you know they're wrong. She pulled up council records again. In the past millennium, how many times has the council revised its fundamental policies or approaches? I can find 3 instances, all of them minor adjustments to existing frameworks. In the same period, humans have completely restructured our civilization dozens of times, experimenting with different forms of government, economic systems, and social organizations. Most of those experiments failed. Some of them failed catastrophically, causing immense suffering. But we learned from those failures and tried something different. That willingness to experiment, to fail, and to try again is what has allowed humans to adapt to changing circumstances faster than your more stable civilizations can. Council Speaker Mordine leaned forward, all 6 eyes focusing intently on Sarah. You're suggesting that instability is a feature, not a flaw? I'm suggesting that flexibility is valuable in an unpredictable universe, Sarah said. You've built a galactic civilization that works well under specific conditions. But what happens when those conditions change? What happens when you encounter a problem that doesn't fit your established solutions? She brought up recent council records. In the past century alone, you've encountered 17 situations that didn't fit your standard protocols. In each case, you formed committees, studied the problem, consulted historical precedents, and eventually implemented modified versions of existing solutions. Those solutions worked adequately in most cases, but in 3 instances, they failed completely. The Zelnari refugee crisis killed 8 million people because council protocols required processing refugees through established channels that couldn't handle the volume. The Korvath asteroid field disaster destroyed 2 mining colonies because your safety regulations assumed equipment that didn't exist yet. The Dalmek Civil War claimed billions of lives because your non-intervention policy prevented action until it was too late. Sarah's voice grew quieter but more intense. In each of those cases, humans were watching from outside the council, and we asked the same question. Why didn't you just do something? The Zelnari could have been evacuated using non-standard transport. The Korvath miners could have been warned even without approved equipment. The Dalmek intervention could have happened years earlier if you'd been willing to bend your rules. But you didn't do those things because they weren't protocol. And changing protocol requires consensus, and consensus requires certainty. And certainty requires extensive study. By the time you were certain enough to act, millions were dead. The council chamber had grown very quiet again. Sarah was hitting them hard with uncomfortable truths, but she needed them to understand the urgency of what she was proposing. Humans would have acted sooner in each of those situations. We probably would have made mistakes, caused unintended consequences, and violated several of your protocols in the process, but fewer people would have died. That's the trade-off you're considering. Council membership for humans means accepting a species that will challenge your established procedures, question your assumptions, and sometimes act without permission when we think lives are at stake. We'll make mistakes. We'll cause problems. We'll be difficult, unpredictable, and frequently frustrating. Sarah's expression softened slightly. But we'll also be there when established procedures fail. We'll be the ones willing to try untested solutions when conventional approaches aren't working fast enough. We'll be the ones who remember that rules exist to serve people, not the other way around. And we'll be the ones who refuse to accept that suffering is inevitable just because helping is difficult. She looked around the chamber at each delegate in turn. You called humans weak, and you were right. We are weak. We break easily. We die in environments you consider normal. And we lack most of the physical advantages you take for granted. But we've spent our entire history learning how to survive despite that weakness, and in the process, we've learned some things about courage, sacrifice, and stubbornness that I think you've forgotten. So here's my final argument for human membership in the Galactic Council. You need someone who remembers what it's like to be weak. You need someone who questions whether your strength has made you complacent. You need someone who's dumb enough to try impossible things because they don't know enough to realize they're impossible. You need humans not because we're strong, but because we've learned that strength without compassion, stability without flexibility, and certainty without doubt eventually become weaknesses of their own. Sarah Chen stood at the human delegation platform, watching the council deliberate. The chamber had erupted into discussion immediately after her final statement, with delegates arguing passionately in their various languages while translators struggled to keep up with the overlapping conversations. She'd said everything she could say. Now the decision rested with beings who had governed the galaxy for longer than human civilization had existed. Council Speaker. Mordine finally restored order after what felt like hours but had probably been only 20 minutes. Her 6 eyes swept across the chamber before settling on Sarah. Ambassador Chen, the Council requires time to deliberate your species application in closed session. However, before we adjourn, I have one final question. Of course, Speaker Mordine. You've spoken eloquently about human values, human sacrifices, and human willingness to challenge established procedures, but you've also acknowledged that humans are prone to mistakes, capable of cruelty, and inclined to act impulsively. If we grant Council membership to humanity, what assurances can you provide that human intervention won't cause more harm than good? Sarah had been dreading this question because she knew the honest answer wouldn't be reassuring, but she'd committed to honesty throughout this presentation, and she wasn't going to start hedging now. I can't provide those assurances, Speaker Mordine. Humans will make mistakes. We'll misjudge situations, act on incomplete information, and occasionally cause harm while trying to help. That's inevitable given our impulsive nature and limited experience with galactic affairs. She saw several delegates react with satisfaction, clearly interpreting her answer as an admission that humanity wasn't ready for membership. But Sarah wasn't finished. However, I can make you a promise about how we'll respond to those mistakes. When we screw up, and we'll acknowledge it. We'll study what went wrong, accept responsibility for the consequences, and work to make things right. We won't hide behind protocol or claim we were following established procedures. We'll own our failures and learn from them. More importantly, I can promise you that humans will never stop trying to help, even after we fail. That's perhaps our most frustrating quality from your perspective. You might prefer species that recognize their limitations and stay within them. But humans have this terrible habit of learning from our mistakes, and then immediately attempting something equally risky because we think we've figured out how to do it better this time. Ambassador Sixthar's appendages formed a pattern Sarah had learned, indicated grudging respect. Ambassador Chen, you're either remarkably honest or remarkably foolish. I haven't decided which. Probably both, Sarah admitted with a slight smile. Humans excel at being multiple contradictory things simultaneously. It's part of our charm. That comment elicited what might have been laughter from several delegates, though their various forms of expressing amusement created a strange symphony of sounds that the translators struggled to render accurately. Even Zixthar's appendages loosened slightly, which Sarah interpreted as a positive sign. Council Speaker Mordine raised her primary appendage again. The Council will now adjourn for deliberation. Ambassador Chen, you will be summoned when we've reached a decision. This may take several hours or several days, depending on the complexity of our discussions. Sarah bowed respectfully and returned to the human delegation area, where her small team of advisors waited anxiously. As soon as she was out of the main chamber, they surrounded her with questions and concerns, but she waved them off. I said everything I could say. Now we wait. The waiting was harder than the presentation had been. Sarah found herself replaying every word, every argument, wondering if she'd emphasized the right points or if she'd been too confrontational with her challenges to council orthodoxy. Her team tried to distract her with other work, but she couldn't focus on anything except the closed chamber doors behind which humanity's future was being decided. 6 hours later, the summons came. Sarah smoothed her suit, took a deep breath, and returned to the council chamber. The atmosphere felt different somehow, though she couldn't quite identify what had changed. Delegates who had seemed openly hostile earlier now regarded her with expressions she couldn't read. Council Speaker Mordine waited until Sarah reached her platform before speaking. Ambassador Chen, the Council has completed its deliberations regarding humanity's application for membership. This discussion has been among the most contentious in recent Council history, with passionate arguments on all sides. Sarah's heart pounded, but she kept her expression neutral. Whatever the decision was, she'd accept it with dignity and figure out humanity's next steps from there. Many delegates argued that humanity's physical limitations make you unsuitable for membership, Mordine continued. Others expressed concern about your species' acknowledged impulsiveness and willingness to violate established protocols. Some questioned whether your idealism would survive prolonged exposure to galactic politics, while others worried that it wouldn't and that you'd become just another cynical power pursuing narrow self-interest. However, other delegates argued that humanity brings perspectives and capabilities the Council currently lacks. They noted that your intervention with the Talari, while technically a violation of protocol, achieved results superior to what established procedures would have produced. They pointed to your contribution to the Viridian Plague response as evidence that human thinking can complement rather than contradict Council expertise. Mordine's 6 eyes all focused on Sarah with an intensity that was almost physical. Most significantly, several delegates who initially opposed human membership changed their positions during deliberations. They were moved by your acknowledgement of human limitations and your promise to own your failures, rather than deflect responsibility for them. Sarah felt a flutter of hope, but tried not to let it show. The speech could still end in rejection, and she didn't want to appear presumptuous. The final vote was conducted according to traditional Council procedures, requiring a 2/3 majority for admission of new member species. The result was 71% in favor of granting full Council membership to humanity, effective immediately. For a moment, Sarah wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. Then the chamber erupted in a mixture of applause, clicking, humming, and various other sounds of approval from the delegates who had voted in favor. Even some who had likely voted against seemed to be offering congratulations through their various forms of gesture. Sarah felt tears threatening and blinked them back. Not yet, she could break down later. Right now, she needed to accept this responsibility on behalf of her entire species. Speaker Mordine, Council delegates on behalf of humanity, I accept this membership with gratitude and humility. We understand the trust you're placing in us, and we will work every day to prove worthy of it. There are conditions, Mordine said, her tone becoming more formal. Humanity will serve an initial probationary period of 50 standard years, during which your actions will be closely monitored. You will be assigned Council mentors to help you understand galactic politics and established procedures. Any intervention with pre-contact species must be reported to the Council immediately, even if such reporting occurs after the intervention has already begun. We accept these conditions without reservation, Sarah replied. Furthermore, Mordine continued, humanity has been appointed to lead a new Council initiative. You will work with other species to review existing protocols and identify cases where established procedures may be causing unnecessary suffering. This committee will have the authority to propose modifications to Council policy, though implementation will still require full Council approval. Sarah felt her eyes widen slightly. That was more than she'd dared hope for. The Council wasn't just accepting humanity. They were immediately putting humans to work on the exact issues she'd raised during her presentation. We're honored by this appointment and will take the responsibility seriously. Ambassador Zixthar's translator activated. Don't make me regret supporting your admission, Ambassador Chen. The universe doesn't need more chaos. It needs chaos that achieves constructive results. Sarah couldn't help but smile. I'll do my best to provide chaos that's at least occasionally useful, Ambassador Zixthar. The Velcross delegates' appendages formed what might have been amusement. That's exactly what concerns me. Over the following weeks, Sarah and her team worked to establish humanity's place in the Council. They met with delegates from dozens of species, learning the nuances of galactic politics and starting to build relationships that would be crucial for future cooperation. The work was exhausting and frequently frustrating, but Sarah threw herself into it with the same stubborn determination that had characterized her presentation. 3 months after humanity's admission, Sarah was reviewing protocol documents in her quarters when an urgent message arrived from the Council chamber. A crisis had emerged on the outer rim. A species called the Corlin were facing environmental collapse, and initial estimates suggested that evacuation was impossible given their unique biological requirements. Sarah read through the situation report, recognizing the pattern immediately. The Council,